Sometimes the most frightening stories don't happen at night or in abandoned houses. They happen in the most mundane places where we go every day, unaware that we might end up in someone's nightmare. This story is not just a scary story, it is a real event that has left behind many questions and horrifying details. Imagine a young man who decided to spend a weekend in peace and quiet, rented a room in a small family motel. An ordinary trip to take a break from the city. But from the very beginning, something went wrong. Someone knocked on his door on the very first evening. No one answered when he asked who was there. Later, he discovered that the door to his room was slightly ajar, although he was sure that he had locked it at night. That was just the first oddity. The next morning, he found a strange note under his door. "Leave the light on. It's important here." What would you do in such a situation? He decided to stay, blaming it all on someone's bad joke. And maybe that was his mistake. On the third night, he woke up to a strange sound. It was like scratching or a soft rustling behind the wall. When he got to the door, he saw that there was another note on the floor. Asterisk, if you can hear them, they already know you're here. Underscore. This person has not been in touch anymore. All that was left were his belongings and a surveillance camera that captured something that could not be explained by logic. So, this story is not just a set of frightening facts, it is a real chronicle of how an ordinary place became something completely different. If you think that this will never happen to you, watch it to the end. The young man, let's call him Adam, was a programmer. Living in a bustling city tired him, and he dreamed of escaping for a while to a place where he could just disconnect from the hustle and bustle. When he came across a website with budget motels, he chose one that was slightly off the tourist routes. The place looked cozy in the photos, and the reviews were a little strange, but nothing criminal. People wrote about outdated furniture or bad Wi-Fi, but nothing that could alert him. Adam arrived there late at night. The motel was small, with 5 rooms, and stood next to a dense forest. At the reception desk, he was met by an elderly man who looked tired and seemed a little annoyed. He quickly handed over the keys and muttered, "Breakfast is from 7 to 9. Be careful with hot water, it happens intermittently." The room turned out to be quite simple: a bed, a small table, a lamp, and the same old-style TV that was mentioned in the reviews. Adam, already exhausted from the long journey, did not pay much attention to the strange smell in the room, a mixture of dampness and something chemical. When he went to bed, there was a knock from the hallway. Barely audible, as if someone had accidentally bumped into the door. Adam went out to check, but the hallway was empty. He thought it was the wind, even though the windows were closed. The morning began with the fact that he was awakened by a knock on the window. When he looked out, a young woman in strangely outdated clothes was standing in front of him. She didn't say anything, just looked at him. Adam froze, and then, gathering his courage, opened the window a crack and asked, "Is there something you want?" The woman looked him straight in the eye and said, "Are you from number 3? "Yes," he replied, feeling his body tense up. "You'd better leave." Before he could ask any questions, the woman disappeared around the corner of the motel. He ran out after her, but found no one. He didn't know then that the third issue had a story of its own. At breakfast, in the small dining room, where everything was covered with a layer of dust, he tried to start a conversation with the owner. The man replied dryly that this woman sometimes visits the guests, and advised them not to pay attention to her. "She's just not right in the head." "It's not your problem," he said, giving Adam a look that Adam couldn't call friendly. But now Adam had a question: why the third room? In the evening, he decided to take a walk around the motel. The forest started just 3 meters from the parking lot, and he noticed that the path led somewhere deeper. After a few minutes of walking, he came across the remains of a stone well overgrown with bushes. "It looks ancient." When he crouched down to take a closer look at it, it seemed to him that something was shining inside. He was curious, but the strange feeling of being watched made him come back. When he returned to the room, there was a note on the floor. It looked like it had been written a long time ago, the ink almost faded. "Pack up and leave. No one stays after the third night." The note sent a chill down his spine. He thought it was someone's stupid joke. Maybe the same elderly motel owner who was having fun this way. But something inside told him to be on his guard. He didn't sleep well that night. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by the sound of water. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the faucet in the bathroom was open and the water was draining into the sink. The bathroom light was flashing, creating an unsettling atmosphere. As he got closer, he noticed that the water in the sink was muddy, as if with dirt. Adam turned off the faucet and looked at the mirror. His heart stopped. On the fogged glass was written, "Are you from number 3? Adam decided it was time to act. He took out his phone, but found that there was no signal. It was no longer a joke. He went to the front desk, but there was no one there. However, there was an old folder on the table. When he opened it, he saw the photos. These were people he had never seen before. They were all standing in front of the door of the third room. On the back of one of the photos was the inscription, "The Last Guest." He didn't even have time to turn around when he felt someone put a hand on his shoulder. Alex had driven a few miles away from the motel, but his hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. The words on the note found in the back seat sounded like an echo in his head, "You can't leave." He felt trapped, despite the fact that the car was speeding along a deserted highway. Intuition told him that this was far from the end. Something dark and inexplicable was following him. The headlights illuminated the road, but the surroundings seemed eerily still. No other cars, no lights from houses or shops. It was as if the whole world was frozen, watching his attempt to escape. On the side of the highway, he noticed a roadside cafe with a flashing neon sign. Alex decided to stop, not so much because of hunger, but because of the need to be among people, to feel that he was not alone in this frightening night. After parking the car, he looked around. The cafe looked shabby, with cracked windows and peeling paint on the walls. But the light inside was warm, and the smell of coffee and roast meat was slightly soothing. He entered, nervously scanning the room. There were 3 customers inside, an elderly woman knitting, a middle-aged man in work clothes who looked suspiciously at the newcomer, and a young girl with bright red hair leafing through a magazine. Behind the counter stood a sullen cook with an apron stained with grease. Alex sat at the farthest table, so that he could see the entrance. He felt paranoid, but there was nothing he could do about it. After ordering coffee, he thought about what had happened. A red-haired girl walked by, stopping next to her for a second. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked with a slight grin. Alex forced a nervous smile. "You could say that." The girl nodded, clearly interested in his condition, but did not ask any more questions. She returned to her table, but while Alex was drinking coffee, he could feel her eyes on him. Suddenly, the door of the cafe opened with a bang, and a man entered the room. His clothes were dirty and his face was covered with fresh cuts. He looked like a fugitive who had just escaped from some terrible mess. The man, seeing Alex, instantly tensed up. He went straight to his table, ignoring the other customers. "You were there too, weren't you?" he asked, sinking into the chair opposite. "Where?" Alex tried to appear calm, even though his heart was pounding. "In that damn motel." The stranger's voice was shaking with rage and fear at the same time. Alex wanted to say that he didn't understand what was being said, but the man's bloodshot eyes didn't give him a chance. "I saw you leave. They won't let you go, just like they didn't let me go. You already had a note, right? This is just the beginning. They will play with you until you break down." Alex froze. The man continued, first they send warnings. Then they start taking it away. Alex felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Who are they? What is it? He asked, feeling his voice tremble. The man leaned closer, his face now inches away from Alex. The ones who stayed at the motel. You can't see them, but they're always there. You made a mistake coming back. The red-haired girl suddenly got up from her seat and walked over to their table. I'm sorry, but both of you seem a little worried, she said, taking a quick glance at the man. Maybe you both should exhale and stop scaring the others. But her voice was interrupted by a loud crack. The headlights of the car parked outside started flashing. Alex turned to the window, and his heart started pounding in his chest again. It was his car. But he knew that he had turned off the engine and taken the keys. Now her headlights were turning on and off rhythmically, as if someone was inside. The man in front of him paled. They're already here, he muttered, taking off. The red-haired girl, on the other hand, looked more annoyed than scared. Calm down, it's probably someone joking, she said, heading for the door. Alex wanted to stop her, but the words stuck in his throat. She went outside, and seconds later, the lights in the cafe flickered and went out. In the silence that followed, there was a sound, quiet but distinct. Footsteps. But their source was unclear. Alex heard the stranger start muttering to himself, and an elderly woman with knitting suddenly screamed and fell to the floor. A man in work clothes rushed to the exit, but the door through which the red-haired girl had just passed now wouldn't budge. Alex felt the cold air touch his skin. This coldness was unnatural, as if it penetrated his bones. In the darkness, he could barely make out the figures of the other customers, but the sound of footsteps was getting closer. At some point, Alex realized that they were not walking on the floor, but on the ceiling. Alex clutched the table, feeling his body tense with terror. The footsteps that sounded on the ceiling grew louder and closer. He tried to figure out what was going on, but his mind refused to accept reality. Soon the footsteps stopped, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell. Suddenly, the door that the red-haired girl had just entered opened with a loud creak. He could see her shadow appearing in the doorway. But it wasn't her. It was the man who had just been sitting across from him. His face was distorted with horror, his eyes were dilated, and his clothes were soaked with something dark and sticky, like blood. They are. What is it? He whispered, almost losing his voice. You shouldn't have stayed. They know everything. Alex stepped back in horror, barely able to stand on his feet. He didn't understand what the man was talking about, but something inside was bubbling with fear. He tried to open his mouth to ask what was going on, but he couldn't make a sound. His whole body seemed to freeze, blocking any possibility of movement or speech. The man looked at him, and there was something creepy in his gaze, something empty and lifeless. He wasn't alive. It was obvious. It seemed that his soul had long since left, leaving only a shell that continued to move and speak. Suddenly, the man turned abruptly and rushed towards the door, screaming shrilly. His words sounded like something from another world. They are. They're already coming for us. We're all dead. Alex tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't work. Fear paralyzed him, forcing him to sit rooted to the spot. He felt a chill seep into his bones, and the air around him became heavy, as if it was filled with unbearable pressure. A figure appeared from the corner where he had just been paying attention. A woman in an old-fashioned dress. She walked slowly, like a shadow, her footsteps made no noise, although other people could be heard running around in panic on the floor. She didn't look like a real person. She had no expression on her face, her eyes were empty, without a soul. Alex realized that this was not a person, but something that had captured his mind and was not going to let go. "You're from number 3, she whispered with a smile that wasn't human. She took a step forward, and the entire space around her seemed to shrink. Alex felt his soul shrink in that hazy, inhuman presence. Suddenly, the light started flashing again, and everything was plunged into total darkness. At that moment, Alex managed to stand up. His legs seemed to come to life, but his body still couldn't be controlled. He ran to the door, trying to escape from this nightmare, but when he turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. He tried to open it again, but now it was locked. Behind him, he heard a soft but distinct sound, as if someone were quietly scratching their fingers on glass. "You can't leave," a voice said, echoing in his head. It was the same woman, but now her words sounded like a warning, as if she was talking about something inevitable. Alex turned around again. She was standing right in front of him, her face very close to his now. He felt her cold, dead gaze, which seemed to pierce right through him. She raised her hand and, without saying a word, touched his face. He felt his skin turn to stone, his body freeze, and the feeling of death filled every cell. It was as if his own life was leaving him, leaving only an empty shell. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, all that remained was to be a part of that darkness. Reality began to blur. He had lost all sense of time, consumed by this nightmare in which there was no escape. Suddenly, like a loud bang, images burst into his brain. They were fast, like flashes. The blurred faces, the walls, the endlessly repeated scenes from his life, intertwined with strangers, familiar, unfamiliar, it was an eternal gallery of the damned. Alex felt his consciousness begin to collapse, consumed by what was around him. Everything was dissolving. And then, like the last moment before the darkness swallowed him up, he realized, the motel was not just a place, but a trap. People who once stayed here disappeared, and their souls became part of something more terrible than fear itself. A place where no one was alive, and no one could leave. He felt his feet sliding on the floor, and suddenly, a door appeared in front of him. Not the one that didn't open. The door that led into the light. A faint ray pierced the darkness, and Alex felt his hands, gaining strength again, reaching for that door. But when he opened it, everything was gone. The motel. Fear. People. All. He was in a different place. On the street. In a normal world. But there was a mark on his arm. Dark, sinister. The entry in his phone, which he couldn't erase, said, "You're not alone. We are always there for you." When Alex tried to stand up, his legs wouldn't work. It was as if he was stuck in a chair, unable to get up. The silence around them was so thick that you could drown in it. The sounds of footsteps coming across the ceiling were now getting louder and clearer. He could feel the cold seeping out of every pore of his skin, as his body was literally covered in sweat. At that moment, he saw something in the corner of the room. Shadow. Vague, but clearly defined. He tensed, his breathing quickened, and his gaze stubbornly fixed on this figure. The shadow became darker, and its outline began to move slowly, as if someone were sliding along the walls. Alex tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. He gritted his teeth, trying to force himself to do something. Suddenly, the door of the cafe burst open with a bang, and a man burst into the room. He was badly battered, his clothes were torn, and his face was stained with blood. He looked at Alex with desperate fear in his eyes, his face distorted with pain. "You shouldn't have come in here," he whispered, rolling to his feet with difficulty. "They keep an eye on everyone who comes here. And now you're in their network. You're next." Alex tried to stand up, but his body was paralyzed. The man, without waiting for an answer, abruptly walked up to the counter and grabbed a bottle with something dark, like ink. He drank it in one gulp, and then his gaze became blank, detached. The man turned and headed for the door, as if under hypnosis. That's when Alex realized he wasn't the only one who was here against his will. This person is the last guest mentioned in the folder at the reception desk. He was one of those who couldn't leave, who was trapped in this place. With each step, the man became more pale, and his movements became more unnatural. Alex felt his own body finding its strength again. He got up and ran to the door, not knowing what was waiting for him behind it. He ran outside, and the cold wind met him with a brutal thud. He rushed to his car, hoping that he would be able to get out. But as soon as he touched the door, he felt a strange vibration under his hands. The car stood as if not moving, as if frozen in time. Alex turned around, trying to figure out what was going on. And then he saw her, the woman in the old-fashioned dress who had appeared at the motel window. She was standing at the edge of the road, looking straight at him, her eyes glassy, empty. She took a step forward, and with each step, her figure became more and more of a blur, as if she didn't exist at all. But Alex couldn't look away. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his heart, and at the last moment he realized that he could not avoid what was about to happen. The woman froze right in front of him, her lips moving, uttering only one word. "It's too late." Alex stood in the middle of the street, his mind seemed to go blank. Everything that was happening seemed so alien, unreal, that my thoughts were confused. He wanted to run away, but he didn't know where to go. He could feel his pulse speeding up, and that strange woman's voice was spinning in his head again, "It's too late." And that's when he realized, this is not an accident. Everything that happened in this place was part of some kind of plan. And he seemed to be just his pawn. Suddenly, there was a dull sound like thunder. The ground shook under his feet. Alex instinctively closed his eyes, but after a few moments he opened them again. Everything was covered with thick, yellow smoke. The sky, already dim, darkened even more. When he looked back, the motel was engulfed in flames. The building was literally cracking from the explosions, the walls were collapsing, crumbling into fiery clouds. Alex could feel the heat, even though he was a considerable distance away. He tried to figure out what was going on, but everything was happening too fast, too chaotically. The explosion was the result of Alex not knowing, or maybe not wanting to know. This place was not just an abandoned motel, it was a refuge for those who took psychotropic drugs, for those who were under control. The building was an entire laboratory, hidden from the world, a place where experiments with consciousness were conducted. All this time, he was taking pills that were slipped to him under the guise of ordinary drugs. But in reality, they were part of the control, part of the game they were playing with him. Psychotropic substances altered his perception, creating illusions and manipulating his mind. Everything he saw, the woman, the murders, the strange events, was the result of manipulation of his mind. He stood on the edge of a collapsed world, and his thoughts seemed to merge into one empty space. A state of apathy gripped him, and despite the flames, smoke, and destruction, he felt strangely cold. Everything was predictable. Everything he had been through didn't matter now. "I don't care," he whispered to himself in response to the threatening fiery flashes. His gaze dimmed, and he stepped forward, towards the disappearing horizon, into the abyss where no one could find him. Alex wasn't worried anymore. He realized that everything that had happened was just the end of his own illusions. The exploded building, psychotropic pills, the woman in the window, these were all just fragments of an empty world that could no longer captivate him. As Alex walked, seemingly exhausted, tired of everything that was happening, his steps became slower and slower, and his gaze dimmed. He didn't notice the silhouettes appearing in his path. The world around him was disappearing, as if he was in some kind of nightmare that couldn't end. He stopped trying to make sense of what was happening. He didn't care. But suddenly, from the depths of the fog, there was a sharp sound. It took him a while, but he soon realized that these were footsteps, someone else's footsteps. He turned, barely catching sight of a figure standing in the darkness. He froze, but it was too late. The dull sound of a gunshot pierced the air, and Alex felt the bullet pierce his body. The pain was searing, unbearable. He didn't even have time to realize what had happened. His body seemed frozen at the moment when he was already falling. Fragmentary thoughts flashed through my head, but my consciousness quickly clouded over, and the last sounds became strangely quiet and muffled. Death himself closed his eyes with a quick, merciless blow. His last breath escaped with difficulty, and the world around him was swallowed by darkness. Whoever fired the shot didn't show up, didn't leave a trace. He just disappeared into the void, like everything Alex had ever known. The building that exploded continued to burn, but it no longer meant anything to him. A dark world full of manipulation and fear engulfed him, leaving no memory, no hope of salvation.